Episode 2, Why Wealth Brings Pressure, Not Freedom. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Fellen, and welcome to this podcast. This series is for you if you're connected to family wealth or a family enterprise, not because you chose it, but because you were born into it. You may be part of it already, or approaching it, or still at a distance, aware that it will all matter a lot more than it does today, but not yet clear precisely in what way. You may remember that last time in episode 1, we addressed the fact that you're going to inherit a lot more than money. Well, today we're going to address an assumption, and it's a common one, perhaps the most common one of all. And that is that having money makes life easier, that it gives you more options, more freedom, fewer constraints. You may agree. Maybe you just haven't articulated it in those terms yet, but you will have absorbed it. Maybe as you were growing up, through experience, through observation, through comparison, and through the simple fact that certain things for you have always been possible, and for others, they have not. That creates a natural conclusion that wealth expands freedom. And in some respect, of course it does. It allows you to make choices that others cannot. It removes certain pressures from you that others experience more directly. It creates space that many don't have. But it also introduces something else, something that is less immediately visible and rarely discussed. And that is pressure, not financial pressure, something far more subtle, and over time, far more significant. Most people associate pressure with limitation, not having enough, needing to secure something, working towards stability. That is a form of pressure pretty familiar to us all. It's visible, measurable, and widely understood. But there's also another kind. One that doesn't come from a lack of something, but from expectation, from being associated with something even if it is just a well-known name, from being seen in a certain way before you have had a chance to define yourself. This form of pressure doesn't restrict your options. In fact, it complicates them, because every choice you make seems to carry additional meaning, not always explicitly, but enough to be felt. What you choose to do in life, where you choose to work, how you choose to live. These are no longer just personal decisions. They are interpreted, sometimes by your families, sometimes by your friends, sometimes by strangers, sometimes by the press and media in certain circumstances and certain communities, sometimes simply by the environment that you are now part of. And that interpretation creates a kind of weight that needs to be carried, not immediately, but gradually. This doesn't all usually arrive at once, of course. It builds slowly. At first, it may show up in small ways, a comment, a comparison, an assumption about what you will do next. Not imposed, but felt all the same. You may notice that certain paths feel just easier to explain than others, that some choices are more readily accepted, whilst others require justification, even if no one has specifically asked for it. Over time, you begin to adjust slightly, not dramatically, but enough. You consider not just what you want to do, but how it will be perceived, whether it fits, whether it aligns. And this is where the shift begins, from freedom as a possibility to freedom as something that needs to be navigated. I've seen this many times. A young adult like you, well-educated, capable, and with genuine options in front of them, trying to decide what comes next. On the surface, it appears so straightforward. You have more flexibility than most due to your family wealth, more room to choose, but the conversation rarely reflects that simplicity. Instead, it circles around questions that are not always stated clearly. Should I join the family business? Should I do something entirely different? Will it be seen as a lack of commitment if I don't engage? Or will it be seen as dependency if I do? They aren't technical questions. They're not about skill. They're about your felt position, about your whole identity, about how your choices will be understood. And because those interpretations are not always explicit, they are often carried on the inside, internally, which makes them much harder to resolve. There's also the question of public visibility. In some families, maybe in yours, this is more pronounced. In others, even wealthy ones, less so. But it is rarely entirely absent when families are successful. Being connected to wealth, particularly over time, creates a form of recognition, sometimes subtle, sometimes more direct. People just know, or even worse, people assume. And that knowledge shapes how you are perceived before you've even started saying anything, before you've even done anything. And whilst that may not seem significant at first, it does have an effect. In fact, it would have an effect on anybody. It changes the starting point. You're not neutral. You're already being interpreted, which means that proving yourself, defining yourself, becomes slightly more complex. Not impossible, but certainly less straightforward. And over time, that can create a kind of tension between how you see yourself and how you are seen by others. The misunderstanding is not that wealth automatically creates pressure, it's that this pressure is often invisible, even to those experiencing it. It doesn't immediately present itself as a problem. In fact, it tends to present itself as a series of small adjustments. Decisions that feel slightly heavier than they should. Choices that are made with an additional layer of consideration. Not because they have to be, but because it feels as though they should be. And because this happens gradually, it's very rarely questioned. It becomes a part of life, part of how things are, until at some point it becomes more noticeable. This tends to happen at moments of transition, when you graduate from college or university, your first job, moving out into your first apartment. In fact, making any significant change, or being faced with that choice and deciding not to. Moments where direction becomes more defined and where naturally others begin to take an interest, not necessarily in a controlling way, but definitely in a way that reflects involvement, expectation, concern. And in those moments, the sense of freedom can feel different, still present, but less absolute, because now your choices are no longer just yours, if they ever were. They now sit within a wider context, and that context responds. You may still feel that this doesn't really fully apply to you, or that, if it does, it's manageable. And in many cases, you are right, it is. But only if it is recognized as pressure, because unrecognized pressure tends to shape behavior indirectly, without being examined, without being named. And that is where it becomes limiting, not in the number of options available to you, but in how freely you feel able to choose between them. Let's look at a more useful way to think about this. Try and think of it this way. It's more accurate to think of wealth not as removing pressure, just as changing its form, from external to internal, from necessity to expectation. And once you see that clearly, something shifts inside you. Not dramatically, but enough. Because what was previously felt but not understood now begins to take shape. And when something begins to take shape, it becomes easier to navigate. Once this form of pressure is present, even slightly, it begins to influence how you make decisions. Not always consciously, but definitely consistently. You start to filter choices, not just through what interests you, but through what seems appropriate, what would be understood, what will be accepted without too much explanation. This doesn't mean you abandon your own direction, but it does mean that your decision-making becomes slightly more constrained, even when it appears open. Let's take an example. Choosing a career. On the surface, you may feel you can do anything. And in practical terms, of course, that may be true. But certain paths might now feel more aligned than others, more coherent with the expectations of those around you, more easily explained perhaps. Others, while equally valid on the surface, might feel less straightforward, not because they're wrong, but because they sit further away from what is familiar. And so, over time, a pattern can emerge. You might be tempted to move towards decisions that minimize friction, that reduce the need for explanation, that maintain a sense of continuity. Again, this is not something imposed on you as such. No one's forcing you, after all, but the effect is similar. What sits beneath this is a trade-off between ease and authenticity. Ease is quite straightforward. It comes from alignment, doing what fits, what makes sense to others, what sits most comfortably within the system that you are a part of. Authenticity is more complex. It comes from choosing based on what really matters to you, even if that choice requires some uncomfortable explanations, even if it creates temporary misalignment. Most people move between these two without fully realizing it, adjusting slightly in one direction or the other, depending on context and who they are talking to. But where the pressure is not recognized, the balance tends to shift towards ease, because ease requires less energy, less explanation, less potential friction. And over time, that can lead to something subtle. It can lead to a sense that your path has been shaped more by your environment than by choice. Not dramatically, but definitely enough to be felt. This doesn't usually become clear immediately, but it builds, and then at a certain point it becomes a lot more visible. You may find yourself explaining a decision and realizing, as you do, that you are framing it in a way that you know will be more acceptable, rather than the most accurate way. Or you may notice that you hesitate before making a change, not because the change itself is problematic, but because of how it will be interpreted. These are small moments, but they are revealing because they show you where the pressure sits, not externally, but internally. If this remains unrecognized, it doesn't cause immediate problems. Life continues after all. Decisions will still be made. Things will progress. But over time, two risks will begin to emerge. First is misalignment between what you're doing and what you would have chosen in the absence of that pressure. This isn't always dramatic. It can be a matter of degree, a direction taken slightly earlier or slightly later, but over time these small adjustments accumulate. The second risk is frustration, not always expressed clearly, sometimes not even fully understood as such, but present, a sense that something is slightly off, that decisions feel heavier than they should, that options, while in theory available, do not feel entirely free. And because the source of that feeling is not always clear, it's often attributed to something else, circumstance, timing, external factors, rather than the underlying dynamic. Recognizing this doesn't mean rejecting it. This is important. The answer is not to ignore expectations entirely, nor is it to push against them just for the sake of independence. Both of these are reactive positions, and they tend to create their own problems. What matters is understanding where the pressure exists, so that your decisions are not shaped by it unconsciously, but considered in light of it. After all, there's a difference between choosing something because it aligns with expectation and choosing something because you believe it is right, knowing that it aligns. The outcome may be the same, but the position is different. One is passive, the other is deliberate. The first step you will need to take is simple. It's to pay attention to where you hesitate. Not in the major decisions, but in the small ones. Moments where you find yourself adjusting your explanation or anticipating a reaction. Those moments are indicators. They show you where external perception is influencing your internal decision-making. The second is to separate the decision from the explanation. What would you choose if no explanation were required? It's not a question you need to answer publicly, of course, but it is a useful internal reference point because it helps you to see the difference between preference and presentation. The third is to observe others, particularly those slightly ahead of you, an older sibling perhaps, or a friend from a similar family, how they navigate this balance, where they seem aligned, where they seem constrained. Those patterns are often easier to see in others than they are to see in yourself, and they offer a useful insight. It's also worth saying something really clearly. In most cases, this pressure is not intentionally created by your family. Your parents are not necessarily trying to direct you in a particular way. More often, they are just trying to protect you, to guide you by the light of their own experiences, to ensure continuity within the family and respect for the legacy you are all part of. And in doing so, certain expectations become embedded, not always explicitly, but through behavior, through what is encouraged, what is questioned, what is discouraged, and what is simply left unsaid. And so understanding this helps avoid a common mistake, which is to interpret pressure as control. In many cases, it is not. It is simply the byproduct of a system that has its own internal logic. If you begin to see this clearly, something shifts, not externally, but internally. You become more aware of how your decisions are being shaped. You begin to distinguish between what you want and what feels expected by others. And that distinction gives you space. Not unlimited freedom, but enough to make decisions with more clarity, enough to engage with expectations without being defined by them, and enough to begin shaping your own path within the system that you are part of. There is another dimension to this pressure, and it tends to be far less visible but far more personal. And it's a dimension that you have probably felt many, many times in your life. Comparison. Not always explicit, often unspoken, but present nonetheless. You will at some point have become aware that your situation is different from those around you. Perhaps it was at university with fellow students who were worried about making it through financially, among friends and the choices they had to make, which you didn't. Where they could go on vacation, in conversations about work, money, or opportunity, what was and is available to you and what is not available to others. At first, this may not feel significant. You may not think it's your problem. Maybe you simply see it as a fact you grew up with, but over time it begins to carry some weight because it changes how your choices are seen and, more importantly, how you see them yourself. A decision that might feel straightforward in isolation can feel far more complicated when placed alongside the reality of others. Taking a risk, for example, starting something new, changing direction. These are decisions that in principle are open to you, but they're not experienced in the same way by everybody. And that distance creates a tension between what is possible and what feels justified. You may find yourself asking questions that are not purely practical. Is this something I've earned the right to do? Am I taking advantage of something that others don't have? Should I be more careful, more responsible, more considered? These aren't questions that arise from necessity. They arise from awareness. And while that awareness can be valuable, it can also become limiting because it introduces a form of self-imposed constraint, and that is not always visible to others. Alongside comparison, there's often a second layer that arises from it, guilt. Not always strong, not always clearly defined, but present somewhere in the background. It doesn't necessarily come from anything specific. It's not always linked to a particular event or decision. It's far more general. A sense that what you have has not been earned in the same way that others earn theirs. and that in some way this should influence how you behave. Again, is not imposed. No one may have said this to you directly, but it does sit there, influencing how you think about your choices, how visible you are, how you speak about your situation. In some cases, it could lead to restraint, holding back, avoiding certain opportunities, pushing yourself further than required, not because the work itself demands it, but because it feels necessary to justify your position and your privilege. Neither response is entirely stable. Both are reactions, not decisions, and over time they can create their own form of pressure. There's also something else that is harder to describe, a sense of expectation, not explicitly stated, but present. You may not be able to point to it directly, but you will recognize it in moments. A reaction from a parent, a comment from a relative, a question that is asked in a particular way. These are small signals, but they accumulate, and they begin to form a picture of what is expected, not formally, but informally. And because it is informal, it is much harder to address. You can't respond to it directly. You cannot clarify it easily. So it remains in the background, shaping how you think about your role, what you should be doing, what you should be moving towards. And again, this influences decisions, not always consciously, but consistently. Individually, none of these elements seem particularly significant. Comparison, guilt, expectation, they're all manageable. And in isolation they are, but together they create a framework within which your decisions are made. A framework that is not entirely your own. And if that framework is not recognized, it becomes the default. You begin to operate within it without questioning it. And over time, that shapes not just what you do, but how you think about what you do. The alternative is not to remove these elements. That is neither possible nor even desirable. Awareness of others matters. A sense of responsibility matters. Understanding expectations matters. But they need to be placed correctly, not as constraints, but as context, guardrails. There is a difference. A constraint limits. It defines what you cannot do. Context informs. Guardrails guide. They help you understand the environment in which you are operating. The goal is not to eliminate pressure, it's to understand it so that it informs your decisions rather than defines them. There is also a point where many people become somehow cautious. Not externally, nothing dramatic changes, but internally they begin to avoid decisions that feel too visible. You may recognize this. You may delay choices that would define you too clearly. You keep optionality. You remain adaptable, which sounds sensible, and in many ways it is. But over time, this caution can become its own form of constraint, not because you lack options, but because you hesitate to commit to any of them. And gradually, freedom becomes theoretical, available in principle, but postponed in practice. And the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to distinguish between careful judgment and avoidance. Which brings us back to the original assumption that wealth creates freedom. Of course it does, but just not automatically. Freedom in this context is not simply the presence of options, it's the ability to choose between them clearly, without being unconsciously shaped by pressures that you have not examined. That kind of freedom is not given. It is developed through awareness, through reflection, through a willingness to look at what is influencing your decisions, even when it is subtle, even when it is uncomfortable. Now, where you are now at this stage, you're not expected to resolve all of this. That would not be realistic, but you are in a position to begin noticing it at least, to recognize where your decisions feel heavier than they should, to question why certain choices feel easier to explain than others, and to understand that this is not accidental. It's part of the environment you're in. And once you begin to see that environment more clearly, something changes. Not immediately, but enough. enough to create space, enough to begin making decisions with a greater degree of clarity. And that, over time, is what allows freedom to become something real, not assumed, but experienced. So, what can you do from here? Here are a few tips. Notice where you hesitate. Pay attention to small moments when you adjust how you explain a decision, when you anticipate how something will be received. That's where the pressure sits. Number 2, separate the decision from the explanation. Ask yourself, in private, what you would choose if no explanation were required. This gives you a clear reference point. Number 3, what's your default? Are you choosing what feels right or just what it's easiest to justify? That distinction matters far more than it appears. 4, treat expectations as context, not constraints. They inform your decisions. They should not define them. 5, name comparison and guilt when they appear. You will feel both at times. Recognizing them early prevents them from shaping your behavior without you noticing. Number 6, look for small signs of misalignment. A decision that feels heavier than it should, a sense that something is slightly off. Don't ignore it. It rarely disappears on its own. Now, none of this requires you to act differently immediately. It simply asks you to see more clearly. Because once you begin to recognize those pressures, something shifts. You create a small distance between expectation and intention, and that distance is where clarity begins. Which brings us back to where we started. Wealth does create freedom, just not in the way it is often described. It does not come from having more options. Those are already there. It comes from understanding what is shaping your choices. And once you see that clearly, you begin to move differently, not in opposition to expectation, not in rejection of it, but with awareness of it. And that is where a different kind of freedom begins, not from the absence of pressure, but from understanding it. And that was episode 2, where we looked at the pressure that wealth brings. Join me next time on this journey to look at the fact that, like it or not, you're already part of the system. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fellen.